The morning I watched Barbara from the HOA march up my driveway with her clipboard in hand. I knew my peaceful Saturday was about to go straight to hell. I had been running my portable generator for exactly 6 hours during a neighborhood-wide power outage, keeping my refrigerator, sump pump, and medical equipment for my elderly father running smoothly. Everyone else on Maple Ridge Drive in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, was doing the same thing, their generators humming away in the cold February air. But somehow, I was the only one getting the visit. "Xavier Olson, I need to speak with you immediately," Barbara announced, her voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured authority that HOA board presidents seem to practice in front of mirrors. She was dressed in her typical pastel cardigan and pearls, her blonde hair sprayed into submission despite the 20-mile-per-hour winds. I set down the coffee I had been enjoying on my front porch and walked down the steps to meet her. "Morning, Barbara. What can I do for you?" She thrust a piece of paper at me, nearly hitting me in the chest with her clipboard. "You are in direct violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the Maple Ridge Community Guidelines. No generators are to be operated within the community without prior written approval from the board. You are hereby fined $500, payable within 7 days." I took the paper and read it twice, certain I was missing something. "Barbara, the power has been out since 3 this morning. My father is on oxygen. Everyone else is running generators too." "I have reviewed the guidelines extensively, Xavier, and they are quite clear. No generators without approval, period." She pointed down the street where I could clearly see and hear at least 4 other generators running. "I will be addressing those violations as well. This is ridiculous." "It is an emergency situation. The power company said it will be at least another 12 hours before power is restored. That ice storm knocked out half the grid." Barbara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Emergency or not, rules are rules. The board established these guidelines for a reason. Generators are noisy, disruptive, and lower property values. If I make an exception for you, I have to make exceptions for everyone. And then where would we be? We would be in a situation where people can keep their food from spoiling and their medical equipment running," I said, trying to keep my voice level. My father was inside, and I did not want him to hear me arguing and get stressed. "The fine stands. 7 days, Xavier. Do not make me send this to collections." She spun on her heel and marched back down the driveway, leaving me standing there with a $500 fine for the crime of keeping my 78-year-old father alive during a power outage. I went back inside and found my father in his recliner, oxygen tube in his nose, watching the battery-powered radio we had set up. "What did the Ice Queen want?" he asked. "Nothing important, Dad. Just HOA stuff." I folded the paper and shoved it in my pocket. The generator outside continued its steady hum, and I had no intention of shutting it off. Barbara could fine me all she wanted, but I was not going to risk my father's health over her power trip. The power came back on around 7 that evening, and I finally shut down the generator. I had spent most of the day researching the HOA guidelines and Ohio state law regarding emergency situations. What I found was interesting. According to Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.06, HOA rules could not supersede state law regarding health and safety emergencies. Power outages that affected medical equipment definitely qualified. Barbara's fine was not just unreasonable, it was likely unenforceable. On Monday morning, I drafted a formal response to the HOA board, citing the relevant statute and requesting the fine be waived. I delivered it personally to Barbara's house, 3 doors down from mine. She answered the door in yoga pants and a fleece jacket, clearly not expecting visitors. Xavier, you should have called first, she said, blocking the doorway as if I might try to force my way inside. I wanted to give you this personally. I handed her the envelope. It is my response to the fine. I think you will find that state law is on my side here. She opened it right there and scanned the contents, her expression hardening with each line. This changes nothing. The board will review your response at our next meeting, but I can tell you right now that we take our community guidelines very seriously. We have a responsibility to maintain standards, even when those standards could endanger someone's life. Oh, do not be dramatic. Your father would have been fine for a few hours without the generator. People managed before all this technology existed. The casual dismissal of my father's health made my hands clench at my sides. That is not your call to make, Barbara. Actually, as HOA president, it is exactly my call to make. Good day, Xavier. She shut the door in my face. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community center. I cleared my schedule and showed up 15 minutes early, taking a seat in the back row of folding chairs. About 20 other residents trickled in, most of them the usual crowd who attended every meeting, the ones who cared deeply about whether their neighbor's mailbox was the approved shade of black or not. Barbara called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m., flanked by the other 4 board members. Susan, the vice president who always agreed with whatever Barbara said. Margaret, the treasurer who seemed perpetually confused. Carl, the only male board member who spent most meetings playing on his phone. And Patricia, the secretary who took meticulous notes but never offered opinions. First order of business, Barbara announced. We have several violations to address from the recent power outage. A total of 8 residents operated generators without prior approval. Fines have been issued to all violators in the amount of $500 each. A man in the third row stood up. This is insane, Barbara. My wife is diabetic. She needs her insulin refrigerated. Was I supposed to just let it spoil? You were supposed to follow the proper procedure and request permission from the board, Barbara replied coolly. We have a process for a reason. How was I supposed to request permission at 3 in the morning during an ice storm? Another woman called out. Barbara rapped her gavel on the table. Order, please. The guidelines clearly state that generators require approval. There is no exception listed for emergencies. If you all have an issue with the guidelines, you are welcome to propose amendments at the appropriate time. But as they currently stand, the fines are valid and will be enforced. I stood up. Barbara, I submitted a formal response citing Ohio state law. Did the board review it? She shuffled through some papers without looking at me. Yes, Xavier, we reviewed your creative interpretation of the law. The board's position is that our community guidelines operate within a separate legal framework and are binding contracts that all residents agreed to upon purchase of their properties. Your fine stands. That is not how contract law works when it conflicts with state statute, I said. You cannot enforce a rule that violates state law. We have consulted with our attorney, and he assures us we are well within our rights, Barbara said, though something in her tone suggested that was not entirely true. Now, moving on to new business. I sat down, furious but knowing that arguing further in this setting would get me nowhere. Around me, the other residents who had been fined were murmuring angrily among themselves. After the meeting, several of them approached me in the parking lot. Are you going to pay that fine? The diabetic woman's husband asked. Absolutely not, I said. I am going to fight it. She cannot enforce rules that put people's health at risk. We should all refuse to pay, someone else suggested. What is she going to do, fine all of us? Actually, that is exactly what she will do, I said. and then she will put liens on your properties. But if you want to fight this, I would suggest we all get together and respond as a group. There is strength in numbers. We exchanged contact information and agreed to meet at my house the following weekend to coordinate our response. As I was getting into my truck, I noticed Barbara watching us from across the parking lot, arms crossed, that same tight-lipped expression on her face. Over the next few days, I did more research into the HOA's history and Barbara's tenure as president. What I found was troubling. She had been president for 6 years, ever since she and her husband moved into the neighborhood. In that time, the number of violations issued had tripled, and the association's reserve fund had somehow decreased by 40% despite regular dues increases. The financial statements were vague at best, listing large expenses as simply community improvements without any detail. I reached out to Margaret, the treasurer, under the pretense of wanting to understand the budget better since I was concerned about my fine and wanted to ensure the money was being used appropriately. She agreed to meet me for coffee at a local shop, probably grateful that anyone was taking an interest in her work. "I'll be honest with you, Xavier," Margaret said, stirring her latte nervously. "I have been trying to get Barbara to provide more detailed accounting for years. She always says the information is available if I want to dig through all the receipts, but she makes it so difficult that I just gave up." "So you do not actually know where $40,000 went?" I had done the math based on the financial statements available on the HOA website. Margaret's eyes widened. "It is that much. I knew the fund had decreased, but I did not realize it was that significant. According to the statements you signed off on, yes. Did you actually review them before signing?" She looked down at her coffee, embarrassed. "Barbara always presents them at the last minute, right before meetings. She says if I have any questions, I can ask her later, but when I do ask, she gets very defensive and makes me feel stupid for not understanding basic accounting." This was a pattern I recognized. Barbara was not just a control freak, she was potentially embezzling from the HOA. I needed more evidence before I made any accusations, but this was a start. "Would you be willing to request detailed receipts for the past year? As treasurer, that is your right." "I suppose I could try," Margaret said doubtfully, "but Barbara is not going to like it." "Margaret, you are the treasurer. It is literally your job. If she refuses, that is a red flag that the board needs to address." She agreed, though I could tell she was anxious about confronting Barbara. I did not blame her. Barbara had a way of steamrolling anyone who questioned her authority. The meeting at my house that Saturday drew 15 of the 20 households that had been fined. We gathered in my living room, my father having agreed to stay in his bedroom to give us privacy. I had prepared copies of the relevant Ohio statutes and a draft letter to the HOA board demanding the fines be rescinded. "The way I see it," I explained to the group, "we have two options. We can each fight this individually, which will be expensive and time-consuming, or we can band together and present a united front. If we all refuse to pay and all cite the same legal reasoning, it becomes much harder for the board to ignore us. But what if they put liens on our houses?" A woman named Jennifer asked. "I cannot risk my credit over $500. If they try to place liens, we can challenge them in court," I said. "And honestly, I do not think it will get that far. I have been looking into the HOA's finances, and there are some serious irregularities. Barbara may have bigger problems than our generator fines once the board looks into where the money has actually been going." That got everyone's attention. I explained what Margaret had told me, being careful not to make direct accusations but laying out the facts as I knew them. "So you are saying Barbara might be stealing from us?" someone asked. I am saying the financial records are not as transparent as they should be, and that is something the entire board should be concerned about. But first, let us deal with these fines. Is everyone in agreement to send this letter and refuse payment? All 15 households agreed. We each signed the letter, and I volunteered to deliver it to Barbara personally the next day. Sunday afternoon, I walked down to Barbara's house with the letter in hand. Her husband answered the door, a mild-mannered man named Doug who always seemed vaguely apologetic for his wife's behavior. "Hi, Xavier," he said. "Barbara is in her office. I will get her." "Thanks, Doug." Barbara appeared a moment later, already irritated before I had said a word. "What now, Xavier?" "I have something for you from the 15 households that were fined for running generators." I handed her the envelope. She tore it open and read quickly, her face turning an impressive shade of red. "This is completely unacceptable. You are organizing the residents against the board." "I am organizing residents to protect their legal rights. There is a difference. This is insubordination. The board will not tolerate this kind of coordinated defiance." "The board does not have a choice, Barbara. You issued illegal fines. We are within our rights to refuse payment. We will see what our attorney has to say about that." She crumpled the letter in her fist. "And since you seem to have so much time to cause problems, maybe I should start inspecting your property more carefully. I noticed your grass was a 1/4 inch too long last week. And is that a weed I saw in your front flower bed? Are you seriously threatening me with retaliatory violations? I am promising you that if you want to play games, I can play games too. Every property in this neighborhood is subject to the same standards, Xavier. You would do well to remember that." I left before I said something I would regret. Doug caught up with me halfway down the driveway. "Xavier, wait," he called quietly. "I am sorry about her. She gets like this when she feels challenged." "This is not about her feelings, Doug. She is violating state law and potentially misusing HOA funds." Doug's face went pale. "What do you mean, misusing funds?" "I mean the association's reserves have dropped by $40,000 in the past few years, with no clear accounting of where that money went. As a resident, you might want to ask your wife about that." I walked back home, knowing I had just escalated things significantly. Barbara was not the type to back down, which meant this was about to get much worse before it got better. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 4 violation notices. My mailbox had a tiny scratch that needed immediate repair. My trash cans were visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. My gutters had a few leaves in them. My house numbers were slightly faded. Each violation came with a $50 fine and a 7-day deadline to correct the issue and pay. I was not the only one. Every household that had signed the letter was suddenly under intense scrutiny. Jennifer got fined because her front door wreath was not on the approved list of decorations. Another resident was cited because his car was parked 6 inches over the edge of his driveway onto the grass. It was pure harassment, and it was coordinated. But Barbara made a mistake. In her zeal to punish us, she overlooked something important. Margaret had actually followed through and requested detailed financial records. When Barbara refused to provide them, Margaret came to me, genuinely frightened about what it might mean. She told me that if I did not trust her, maybe I should resign from the board, Margaret said. We were meeting at the coffee shop again, and she looked like she had not slept in days. "Xavier, I have been on this board for 4 years. She has never talked to me like that before." "That is because you have never questioned her before," I said. "Margaret, I need you to do something, and it is going to be uncomfortable. I need you to formally request those records in writing at the next board meeting with all the other board members present. Make it official." She will be furious. Probably. But if she refuses in front of the entire board, that is grounds for the other members to start asking questions. And if she does provide the records, then we will finally know where that money went. Margaret agreed, though she looked like she might throw up. The next board meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks out, which gave me time to prepare for another issue that had just emerged. Another ice storm was forecasted to hit Cleveland, this one potentially worse than the last. The meteorologists were predicting widespread power outages lasting days, not hours. And I had already been informed by Barbara in writing that if I ran my generator during this outage, my fine would increase to $2,000, and potential legal action would be taken. I consulted with an attorney, a friend from high school named David who specialized in property law. He reviewed all the documentation I had gathered and gave me his assessment. "Barbara is insane," he said bluntly. "These fines are unenforceable. Ohio law is crystal clear on this. You can absolutely run a generator during an emergency if you have medical equipment that requires power. The HOA cannot override that. So what do I do when she tries to fine me again? Ignore it. Let her take you to court if she wants. I will represent you for free just for the entertainment value of watching a judge tear apart her argument." David leaned back in his chair. "But Xavier, this thing about the finances is more serious. If she is embezzling, that is criminal. You need to be careful about making accusations without solid proof. That is why I need to see the actual records. Once Margaret requests them officially, Barbara will either have to produce them or explain why she cannot. Either way, we'll have our answer." The ice storm hit on a Tuesday night, even worse than predicted. By Wednesday morning, power was out across 3 counties, and the utility company was estimating 4 to 6 days for full restoration. I fired up my generator at dawn, as did most of my neighbors. The difference this time was that we were all coordinated. Everyone who had signed that letter ran their generators openly, daring Barbara to do something about it. She did. By Wednesday afternoon, I had a certified letter delivered to my door by a process server. The HOA was filing for an injunction to force me to shut down my generator immediately, claiming I was in breach of community covenants and causing a nuisance. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning at the Cuyahoga County Courthouse. I called David immediately. "They are actually taking me to court." "Excellent," he said. "I will draft our response. This is going to be fun." Friday morning was bitterly cold and the power was still out throughout the region. I met David at the courthouse, and we made our way to the judge's chambers for what was supposed to be a brief hearing. Barbara was there with the HOA's attorney, a tired-looking man in his 60s who I suspected had tried to talk her out of this. The judge, a woman in her 40s named Judge Rachel Martinez, reviewed the paperwork with obvious irritation. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said, looking at the HOA's attorney. "Your client wants to force Mr. Olson to shut down his generator during a state of emergency because it violates HOA covenants." "That is correct, Your Honor," the attorney said, though he sounded deeply unenthusiastic about it. "And Mr. Olson has a 78-year-old father living with him who requires oxygen equipment that needs electricity to function." "Yes, Your Honor," David said. "My client's father has severe COPD and cannot survive for extended periods without his oxygen concentrator." Judge Martinez turned to Barbara. "Madam, are you the HOA president?" "Yes, Your Honor. And I want to emphasize that we have very clear community guidelines that all residents agreed to. We cannot simply ignore them whenever someone claims an emergency." "This is not someone claiming an emergency," the judge said sharply. "This is an actual emergency. The governor has declared a state of emergency. There are shelters set up throughout the county. And you want to force a man to shut down the generator, keeping his elderly father alive because of HOA covenants. The covenants are legally binding, Your Honor. Judge Martinez stared at her for a long moment. Motion denied. Mr. Olson, you may continue operating your generator as long as the power outage continues. Furthermore, I am ordering the HOA to cease any attempts to fine Mr. Olson or any other resident for operating generators during this emergency. Is that clear? Your Honor, I must object, Barbara started. You can object all you want. My ruling stands, and I suggest your HOA consult with your attorney about Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.06 before you waste any more of this court's time. She banged her gavel. We are done here. Outside the courthouse, Barbara was shaking with rage. This is not over, Xavier. Actually, Barbara, I think it is. But while I have you here, you should know that Margaret is going to be requesting detailed financial records at the board meeting next week. I am sure you will have everything ready for her. Her expression shifted from rage to something that looked almost like fear. The financial records are none of your business. They are every resident's business. We pay dues. We have a right to know how that money is being spent. She turned and walked away without another word, her attorney hurrying to catch up with her. David clapped me on the shoulder. That went well, but you really poked the bear with that comment about the finances. Good. I want her worried. The power came back on Sunday evening, and I finally shut down the generator. My father was fine, though exhausted from the stress of the past few days. Most of the neighborhood had weathered the outage without major issues, thanks to their generators and preparation. But Barbara's house had a problem. I found out about it Monday morning when I saw several vehicles in her driveway, including a plumber's truck and a water damage restoration van. Jennifer, who lived across the street from Barbara, filled me in. Their basement flooded, she said gleefully. Apparently their sump pump failed during the outage, and water just poured in. Doug came out Sunday morning and saw water running out from under their garage door. I heard them arguing about it. He kept asking Barbara why she didn't run the generator to power the sump pump, and she kept insisting that it wouldn't have been appropriate since she had forbidden everyone else from using generators. I felt a small twinge of satisfaction, which probably said something about my character that I should examine later. How bad is the damage? From what I could see, pretty bad. They were carrying out boxes of stuff that was completely ruined. Furniture, holiday decorations, you name it. I heard the plumber say something about mold remediation being necessary. The board meeting that Thursday was packed. Word had spread about Judge Martinez's ruling, about Barbara's flooded basement, and about the upcoming request for financial records. People who had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives showed up just to watch the drama unfold. Barbara called the meeting to order, but her usual commanding presence was diminished. She looked tired and stressed, and there was a slight tremor in her hands as she shuffled her papers. First order of business, she said. I need to inform the board and residents that the recent legal action regarding generator usage was unsuccessful. The judge ruled in favor of the defendant. You mean Xavier, someone called out. His name is Xavier. Barbara's jaw tightened. Yes. The judge ruled that HOA covenants cannot supersede state law regarding emergency power usage. As such, the board will be revising Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the Community Guidelines to include an exception for documented emergencies. There was scattered applause, which seemed to irritate her further. Second order of business, Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly. I am formally requesting detailed financial records for the past 3 years, including receipts and documentation for all expenses listed under community improvements. As treasurer, I believe this is necessary to ensure proper fiscal oversight. The room went completely silent. Barbara's face drained of color. "Margaret, this is hardly the time or place for such a request," she said. "Actually, this is exactly the time and place," Carl said, suddenly paying attention for the first time in what was probably years. "I've been wondering about those community improvements myself. What exactly did we spend $40,000 on?" "The information is all available in the files," Barbara said. "Margaret knows where to find it." "Then there should be no problem producing it," Patricia, the secretary, added quietly. Barbara looked around the table, realizing she was cornered. "Fine. I will compile the information and have it available next week." "I would like the information available within 72 hours, Margaret said, surprising everyone including herself. "As treasurer, I have a fiduciary responsibility to the association. If the records are as readily available as you claim, 3 days should be more than sufficient." Barbara's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Fine. 72 hours. The rest of the meeting proceeded in a tense atmosphere. When it finally ended, I waited outside for Margaret. "That was brave," I told her. "I am terrified," she admitted. "But you were right. Something is not right with the finances, and I need to know what." 72 hours later, Barbara sent an email to the board members claiming she needed additional time to compile the records. Margaret forwarded the email to me. "What do I do?" she asked over the phone. "You call an emergency board meeting and you make it clear that Barbara needs to produce the records immediately or face removal from the board." "Can we even do that?" Check the HOA bylaws. I am betting there is language about fiduciary responsibility and failure to fulfill duties. Margaret called back an hour later. "You are right. If a board member fails to fulfill their duties after being given reasonable notice, the board can vote to remove them with a 2/3 majority. Then call the meeting." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning. Barbara tried to prevent it, claiming it violated protocol, but Margaret stood firm. When Saturday arrived, all 5 board members were present, along with myself and about a dozen other residents who had gotten word of what was happening. "Let us get to the point," Carl said. "Barbara, do you have the financial records Margaret requested?" "I have some of them," Barbara said, sliding a thin folder across the table. "The rest are stored off-site and will take more time to retrieve." Margaret opened the folder and flipped through the contents. "This is only 6 months of records and there are no receipts for any expense over $500. This is not what I requested. It is what is immediately available." "Barbara," Patricia said gently, "why are you making this so difficult? Just provide the records." "Because there are no records," Carl said suddenly. "That is what is going on here, isn't it? You have been spending HOA money without proper documentation." "That is absurd," Barbara snapped. "I have dedicated 6 years to this community. I have worked tirelessly to maintain our standards and property values, and this is how you thank me? By accusing me of theft." "No one is accusing you of anything," Margaret said. "We just need to see the records. If you have been spending the money appropriately, the records will show that." "I resign," Barbara said abruptly. "Effective immediately. If this is the kind of treatment I can expect after years of service, then I want nothing more to do with this board." She stood up and walked out, leaving the remaining board members staring at each other in shock. "Well," Carl said finally, "I guess that solves that problem." "Actually, it does not," I said from my seat in the back. "She just left with 6 years of financial records and no accountability for how the money was spent. If there was misappropriation of funds, resigning does not make that go away." Margaret looked at me. What do we do? You file a police report, I said. The HOA funds are not Barbara's personal money. They belong to the association. If she misused them, that is theft. And if she is refusing to turn over records, that is evidence tampering. The board members looked at each other uncomfortably. This had escalated far beyond HOA politics into potential criminal territory, and none of them seemed prepared for it. Susan, the former vice president who had always supported Barbara, spoke up for the first time. Maybe we should consult with an attorney before we involve the police. We should do both, Carl said. If money has been stolen from the association, the police need to know. And we need an attorney to figure out our liability exposure. It took another hour of discussion, but eventually the board agreed to contact both the police and an attorney. I volunteered to go with Margaret to file the police report, partly to provide moral support and partly because I wanted to make sure it actually got done. The Brecksville Police Department took our report seriously, especially when Margaret explained the amounts involved and Barbara's refusal to provide documentation. The detective assigned to the case, a sharp-eyed woman named Detective Lisa Morrison, asked detailed questions about the HOA's structure, Barbara's authority, and what oversight existed. I am going to be honest with you, Detective Morrison said. These kinds of cases are complicated. HOAs operate in a gray area legally, and proving criminal intent can be difficult. But I will investigate and see what I can find. In the meantime, I would suggest your board take steps to secure any remaining funds and change all passwords and access codes. Over the next 2 weeks, a picture emerged that was even worse than I had suspected. Detective Morrison obtained a warrant for Barbara's financial records and discovered that she had been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses for at least 3 years. Renovations to her house, vacations, a new car. She had been careful at first, disguising the expenses as legitimate association costs, but had grown bolder over time. The total amount misappropriated was over $60,000. When the police arrived at Barbara's house to arrest her, half the neighborhood came out to watch. I stayed inside, not wanting to gawk, but I heard about it from multiple sources. Barbara had denied everything, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. Doug had stood on the front lawn looking devastated. The police had taken her away in handcuffs while she shouted about persecution and witch hunts. She was charged with theft and tampering with records. The local news picked up the story, running segments about the HOA president who had fined residents for running generators during an emergency while simultaneously embezzling from the association. It was not the kind of publicity our neighborhood needed. The new board president, Carl, called an emergency meeting of all residents to address the situation. The community center was standing room only. I want to start by apologizing, Carl said. The board failed in its oversight responsibilities. We trusted Barbara to handle the finances without proper verification, and that was a mistake. We are working with law enforcement and our attorney to recover as much of the stolen funds as possible. What about all those fines she issued? Someone called out. Are those still valid? The board has voted to rescind all fines issued in the past year, Carl said. We will be sending out formal notices this week. Additionally, we are conducting a comprehensive review of all HOA guidelines to ensure they comply with state and federal law, and that they serve the actual interests of the community, rather than being tools for harassment. What about reimbursement for people who already paid their fines? Jennifer asked. We are working on that. It may take some time given the financial situation, but everyone who paid a fine will be reimbursed. After the meeting, several people thanked me for pushing back against Barbara's overreach. I accepted their thanks, but felt uncomfortable with the attention. I had not set out to expose Barbara's theft. I had just wanted to keep my father safe during a power outage. Everything else had spiraled from that one confrontation. Doug approached me as I was leaving. "Xavier, can I talk to you for a minute?" We stepped outside into the cold evening air. Doug looked like he had aged 10 years in the past month. "I did not know," he said. "I swear I had no idea she was taking money from the HOA. I knew she was intense about the board, but I thought it was just because she cared about the neighborhood." "I believe you, Doug. Our savings are gone. She spent everything on legal fees and restitution negotiations. We are probably going to have to sell the house." He shook his head. "I keep thinking about that ice storm. She was so adamant about not running the generator, even when I told her the sump pump needed power. She said it would make her look like a hypocrite after she fined everyone else, so she let our basement flood out of pride." "I am sorry, Doug. I know this is not easy for you." The prosecutor offered her a plea deal: 5 years probation and full restitution if she pleads guilty. Her attorney is telling her to take it, but Barbara keeps insisting she can fight it, that she can make a jury understand how hard she worked for this community. He laughed bitterly. "She really believes she earned that money somehow. Is she going to take the deal? I hope so. I cannot afford to pay for a trial, and if she is convicted after trial, the sentence will be much worse. But Barbara has never been good at admitting when she is wrong." Doug went back inside, leaving me alone in the parking lot. I thought about everything that had happened over the past 2 months, how a simple generator during a power outage had unraveled Barbara's entire scheme. If she had just left me alone, if she had not been so determined to punish anyone who challenged her authority, she might have continued stealing for years. Barbara ended up taking the plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of theft and 1 count of tampering with records. The judge sentenced her to 5 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered her to pay full restitution of $62,000. The judge also made it clear that if Barbara violated any terms of her probation, she would serve the suspended 3-year prison sentence that hung over her head. "Mrs. Hartwell," the judge said at sentencing, "you were given a position of trust by your community, and you betrayed that trust for personal gain. You prioritized your own desires over the needs of your neighbors, and you used your authority to harass and intimidate anyone who questioned you. This sentence is intended not just to punish you, but to send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated." Barbara stood silently through the lecture, her face blank. When it was over, she walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. Doug filed for divorce 2 weeks later. He ended up selling their house and moving to Florida to live near his daughter. I felt bad for him, but I understood why he needed to get away from the whole situation. The HOA spent the next 6 months rebuilding. Carl turned out to be a competent and reasonable president. He streamlined the guidelines, eliminating the petty rules that served no real purpose. He established proper financial oversight, with monthly reports available to all residents, and a requirement that any expenditure over $1,000 be approved by the full board. He also created an emergency exceptions policy that explicitly allowed generators, snow removal, and other necessary activities during crisis situations. Property values in Maple Ridge actually increased once word spread that the nightmare HOA president was gone. Several houses that had been on the market for months sold quickly. New families moved in, and the neighborhood felt more friendly and welcoming. My father's health remained stable. His oxygen equipment ran reliably, powered by the grid and backed up by the generator that sat ready in my garage. He liked to joke that he was responsible for bringing down a corrupt HOA president, and I never corrected him. I ran into Margaret at the grocery store one afternoon. She had been elected treasurer again under the new board and seemed much happier. "I wanted to thank you," she said as we stood in the produce section. "If you had not pushed me to request those records, Barbara would still be stealing from us." "You are the one who had the courage to actually request them," I said. "I just pointed you in the right direction." Still, I learned something important. Sometimes the rules need to be challenged, especially when the people enforcing them have ulterior motives. She smiled. "My husband says I have become a rebel in my old age." The following winter brought another ice storm, though not as severe as the previous year. The power went out for about 18 hours. I ran my generator without hesitation, as did most of my neighbors. No one received any fines. No one was threatened with legal action. The HOA sent out an email reminding residents to stay safe and offering assistance to anyone who needed help. It was how an HOA should function, I realized. Not as a tool for petty tyrants to exert control, but as an organization that actually served the community's interests. Barbara's house remained empty for several months after the sale closed. Eventually, a young couple with 2 small children bought it. I introduced myself when they moved in and welcomed them to the neighborhood. "We heard about what happened with the previous HOA president," the husband said. "That is actually one reason we felt comfortable buying here. We figured any neighborhood that successfully dealt with that kind of problem must have good people living in it." "We try," I said. Life returned to normal, or as normal as life gets in a suburban HOA community. There were still occasional disputes about tree trimming and fence heights, but they were handled reasonably, without the vindictive edge that had characterized Barbara's reign. Carl served 2 years as president before passing the torch to Jennifer, who brought fresh energy and new ideas. I attended board meetings occasionally, mostly to stay informed. I never had any desire to serve on the board myself. My experience with Barbara had taught me that some battles are worth fighting, but that did not mean I wanted to be in charge of making sure everyone's mailbox was the correct color. My father passed away 3 years after the events with Barbara, peacefully in his sleep. He had lived long enough to see his granddaughter graduate from college and to meet his first great-grandchild. At his funeral, several neighbors mentioned how much they had admired his fighting spirit and how he had been part of something important in the neighborhood. I kept the generator, maintaining it carefully each year. It sat in my garage, a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up for what is right, even when it seems like a small thing. Running a generator during a power outage should not have been controversial. It should not have led to fines and legal battles, and the eventual exposure of a criminal scheme. But it did, because Barbara had created a system where challenging her authority was seen as a threat to the entire community. She had wrapped herself in the language of rules and standards and property values, while using that authority to steal and harass. And she might have continued indefinitely if she had not overreached by trying to fine me for keeping my father alive during an emergency. The final piece of the story came 4 years after Barbara's sentencing. I received a letter from the prosecutor's office informing me that Barbara had successfully completed her probation and paid her restitution in full. She had apparently gotten a job doing data entry and had been making monthly payments faithfully. Doug, through his attorney, had agreed to cover a portion of the restitution as part of their divorce settlement, which had expedited the process. I never saw or heard from Barbara again. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to another state, possibly Arizona or New Mexico. Someone claimed to have seen her profile on a dating site. Someone else said she was working for a property management company, though that seemed unlikely given her criminal record. I did not really care what happened to her. She had faced consequences for her actions, and the community had recovered. That was enough. On the 5th anniversary of that first ice storm, we had another power outage, this one caused by a transformer fire. I fired up my generator at 2 in the morning, the familiar hum filling the quiet street. Within minutes, I heard other generators starting up around the neighborhood, a symphony of preparedness and resilience. No fines arrived. No angry HOA president showed up with a clipboard. Just neighbors taking care of their families and their homes the way it should be. I stood on my front porch in the dark, watching the stars that were visible for once without light pollution. The generator hummed steadily. Inside, my house had power. My refrigerator ran. My sump pump protected my basement from flooding. And I thought about how everything had worked out, how standing up to Barbara's unreasonable fine had led to exposing her theft and ultimately improving life for everyone in the neighborhood. It had not been my intention. I had just wanted to keep my father safe. But sometimes doing the right thing in one area forces light into other dark corners. The power came back on at dawn, and I shut down the generator. Another outage weathered, another crisis managed. Life in Maple Ridge Drive continued, better than before, built on a foundation of reasonable rules and actual community, rather than the petty tyranny of one woman's need for control. I went inside and made coffee, looking forward to a quiet Saturday. The generator sat in the garage, ready for the next emergency. The HOA operated smoothly under Jennifer's leadership. The neighborhood thrived, and Barbara's flooded basement had been the least of what she deserved, though I took no pleasure in it. Justice had been served, restitution made, and the community healed. That was all anyone could ask for. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to the biggest changes. Sometimes refusing to pay an unjust $500 fine exposes $62,000 in theft. Sometimes running a generator during a power outage brings down a corrupt HOA president and improves an entire neighborhood. I finished my coffee and looked out the window at Maple Ridge Drive, at the houses with their approved mailboxes and reasonably maintained lawns and happy families inside. It was a good place to live, finally, now that the rules served the community instead of one person's ego. And if another ice storm came, if another power outage hit, I would run my generator without hesitation or fear. Because that was my right, and it was the right thing to do, and no HOA president would ever make me choose between following arbitrary rules and taking care of my family again. The story ended there, with the community restored and justice served and life moving forward. Barbara got what she deserved. The neighborhood got the HOA it needed. And I got to keep my generator, my dignity, and the knowledge that sometimes standing up to bullies leads to exposing corruption and making the world a slightly better place.